There is a moment in The Hobbit, the Battle of the Five Armies, that stops a lot of people cold. Legolas has just learned something devastating, and instead of comfort, instead of explanation, instead of the truth he deserved, his father Thranduil gives him almost nothing. He tells Legolas to seek out a ranger in the north, a young man who goes by the name Strider, and then he essentially sends his son away. No full answers, no open grief shared between them. Just a king closing a door on something deeply personal. And if you have ever watched that scene and felt like something was missing, like there was a whole story underneath those few words that Thranduil refused to tell, you are absolutely right. Because the mystery of Legolas's mother is not just a gap in the lore. It is a window into who Thranduil really is, why he built the walls he built, and what it costs an immortal being to carry grief across centuries. Today we are going to dig into all of it. We are going to look at what we actually know, what we can reasonably piece together, and what the silence itself tells us about one of the most complicated elven rulers in all of Middle-earth. And I promise you, by the end of this, Thranduil is going to hit very differently than he did before. Let us start with the basic facts, because it is important to be honest about what Tolkien actually left us here. In the canonical texts, meaning the novels themselves, the appendices and the letters, Tolkien never named Legolas's mother. He never described her. He never directly explained what happened to her. This is not an oversight. Tolkien was meticulous. He built entire genealogical trees and linguistic systems for cultures that appear in a single paragraph. The absence of Legolas's mother from the written record is a deliberate blank space. And the question becomes, why does that blank space exist? And what does it mean within the world Tolkien constructed? Now here is where things get genuinely interesting. We know that elves, unlike mortals, do not simply die of illness or old age. They are bound to ardor for as long as the world lasts. But they can be killed in battle or by violence. And there is something else, something that Tolkien described in his writings about elven nature, something that is actually more haunting than physical death. Elves can essentially fade. They can be so broken by grief, by loss, by trauma so profound that their spirit loses its grip on the physical world. It is a kind of spiritual diminishment, a slow fading from existence that comes not from a sword or an arrow, but from sorrow that overwhelms everything else. This concept is crucial to understanding what may have happened to the Queen of Mirkwood. Because Thranduil's realm was not a peaceful paradise. It was a kingdom under siege, surrounded by growing darkness, constantly fighting to survive. Now let us talk about Thranduil himself for a moment, because you cannot understand why he hid the truth without understanding who he fundamentally is and what shaped him. Thranduil is a Sindar elf, which means he comes from a kindred that never made the journey to Valinor. He was born into a world already marked by loss. His people had roots going back to Doriath, one of the great elven kingdoms of the First Age, and Doriath was destroyed. Not slowly, not through some gradual fading, but violently, invaded and shattered by the sons of Feanor in one of the most brutal events in elven history. Thranduil and his father Orifer were among those who fled east after that catastrophe, carrying the memories of a fallen homeland and the weight of watching everything their people had built crumble into ruin. So before Thranduil ever became king of the woodland realm, before he ever sat beneath Mirkwood's trees in his underground halls, he had already experienced the total destruction of the world he grew up in. He had already learned that the things you love most can be taken from you completely and without mercy. That context matters enormously when we start thinking about how he might handle another devastating loss later in his life. When Thranduil eventually became king in Greenwood the Great, the forest that would later be called Mirkwood, he was ruling over a realm that grew increasingly dangerous as the Third Age progressed. Sauron's influence crept into the southern parts of the forest from his stronghold at Dol Guldur. The forest itself darkened. Spiders moved in. Orcs raided constantly. The northern parts where Thranduil's halls were carved into the rock remained defensible, but the kingdom was perpetually under threat. This is the environment in which Legolas grew up. And this is the environment in which, at some point, the Queen was lost. Here is what Peter Jackson's film adaptation gave us that Tolkien never explicitly stated, and we should be clear about this distinction. In the desolation of Smaug, there is a brief moment where Thranduil tells Tauriel that she cannot choose who she loves, because sometimes love fades, or something close to that sentiment. And in the Battle of the Five Armies, when Legolas asks his father about his mother, Thranduil's response is deeply telling even in its restraint. He confirms she is gone. He confirms that he loved her. And then he says something to the effect that he could not forget her face even if he wanted to. That is Peter Jackson's interpretation, and while it is not canon in the strictest sense, it draws on something real about elven grief as Tolkien described it. Because here is the thing about elven loss that most people underestimate. When an elf loves someone, that bond is not casual or temporary the way human relationships often are. Elves marry once. Their bond is deep and fundamental to their identity. When that bond is severed by death, the surviving elf carries something that has no human equivalent. It is not just grief the way we understand grief. It is closer to having part of your own soul removed. Some elves respond to this by sailing west to Valinor, essentially seeking a kind of healing that Middle-earth cannot provide. Some, as Tolkien described, simply fade over time, unable to sustain their connection to the world when that connection has been so severely damaged. Thranduil did not sail west. Thranduil did not fade. He stayed. He kept ruling. He kept defending his realm and his people for centuries after losing his queen. And that choice, that stubborn refusal to yield to grief, tells us something critical about why he could not fully open up to Legolas about what happened. Think about it from a psychological standpoint, and yes, we can absolutely apply psychology to Tolkien's characters because he was deeply interested in the interior lives of his creations. For Thranduil to tell Legolas the full story of his mother's fate, whatever that fate was, he would have to go back there. He would have to revisit the worst thing that ever happened to him. Not as a distant historical fact, but with the full weight of elven memory, which is perfect and total and never truly fades with time the way mortal memory does. Elves do not get the mercy of forgetting. Every detail, every moment, stays exactly as vivid as it was when it first occurred. For a man who has been carrying that weight for potentially hundreds of years, the act of speaking it aloud is not just painful. It is re-traumatizing in a way that is almost impossible to explain. And there is another layer to this that we need to address, because it changes everything about the dynamic between Thranduil and Legolas. Thranduil is a king. That is not just a title. It is the framework through which he understands his entire existence. The survival of his people has been his responsibility through the fall of Doriath, through the wandering years, through the long shadow of Sauron spreading across Mirkwood. He has made himself into something almost unbreakable because unbreakable is what his people needed him to be. The coldness, the distance, the emotional wall that we see in his character, those are not personality flaws. They are the armor of someone who decided very deliberately that he could not afford to fall apart, because if he fell apart, his realm fell apart with him. Telling Legolas the truth about his mother would require Thranduil to lower that armor. It would require him to show his son not the king, not the unshakable ruler of the woodland realm, but the elf who loved someone and watched her go, and who has been living with that absence ever since. And Thranduil, being who he is, being shaped by everything his history made him into, does not know how to do that. It is not that he does not want to. It is that the mechanism for that kind of vulnerability may have calcified shut over centuries of deliberate hardening. Now let us consider another possibility that sits alongside the grief explanation, because these things are not mutually exclusive. There may be specific circumstances around the Queen's death that Thranduil finds particularly difficult to articulate. We do not know in canonical terms how she died, but if we take seriously the idea that she may have been killed in one of the many battles or raids that plagued Mirkwood during the Third Age, or if she fell to the darkness spreading from Dol Guldur, then there could be an element of guilt woven into Thranduil's silence. What if, in some way, he felt responsible? What if there was a decision he made, or did not make, that played a role in what happened to her? Kings carry the consequences of their choices, and Thranduil is a king who has already had to live with catastrophic consequences before. His father Oropher died in the last alliance of elves and men during the war against Sauron at the end of the Second Age, and the circumstances of that death are tangled up in questions of strategy and command, and Oropher's refusal to defer to Gil-galad's orders. There is already a pattern here of Thranduil witnessing death that has complicated causes. Death where the question of who bears responsibility is not simple or clean. If the Queen's death carries any similar complexity, then Thranduil's silence becomes even more layered. He is not just protecting himself from grief. He is protecting Legolas from a truth that might damage the way his son sees him. He is protecting his own image as the invulnerable king. And perhaps, on some level, he is protecting the memory of the woman he loved from being reduced to a story about loss and failure. Let us pause here for a moment and sit with what this means for Legolas, because we often focus on Thranduil and forget the other side of this. Legolas grew up without his mother and apparently without any real information about what happened to her. Imagine what that is like for an elven child. Elves are creatures of deep memory and deep connection. They are embedded in history and lineage and relationship in ways that define their sense of self. To grow up with that fundamental blank space, to have a father who cannot or will not talk about the person who should have been half of your world, that leaves a mark. It explains something about Legolas that the films gesture at without fully spelling out. There is a quality of solitude in him, even amid the fellowship. He is loyal and brave and genuinely caring, but there is something slightly set apart about him, something that mirrors his father in ways he probably does not fully recognize. Thranduil's silence did not just protect himself. Intentionally or not, it shaped Legolas into someone who learned from his father that some wounds are not spoken aloud, that some losses are carried privately, that you keep moving, keep functioning, keep serving your purpose regardless of what is breaking underneath. In some ways, Legolas is exactly the elf his father raised him to be. And in other ways, that is exactly the tragedy. Now, there is something I want to bring up that often gets overlooked in these conversations, and it connects to the broader context of what Mirkwood was actually like during the centuries when Legolas was growing up. Thranduil's kingdom was not just dealing with external threats from orcs and spiders and the shadow of Dol Guldur. There was something happening to the forest itself. The trees were darkening, sickening, being influenced by the malice that had taken root in the southern regions. The king could feel it. His people could feel it. Births became rare in Mirkwood during the Third Age, something the reference material confirms, because elves having children requires a kind of hope and peace that was in very short supply in that darkened forest. The fact that Legolas was born at all, that he existed and survived and grew into the warrior we know, is itself remarkable given the conditions of the realm he came from. That context tells us that the Queen was lost in an era of extraordinary difficulty, during a slow apocalypse of corruption and shadow that lasted centuries. Whatever happened to her happened within that darkness. And Thranduil, who was fighting that darkness every single day while simultaneously grieving, while simultaneously maintaining the facade of an unbroken king, was not in a position to give his son the open, honest, emotionally available explanation that Legolas needed. He was in survival mode, not just personally, but as the leader of an entire people who needed him to be more wall than window. Here is something that makes Thranduil genuinely fascinating as a character, and I think this is the heart of it all. He is an elf who chose a fundamentally un-elven response to loss. The elven tradition for dealing with unbearable grief is to sail west, to seek the healing of Valinor, to yield to the pull of something greater than your own endurance. Thranduil rejected that. He chose to stay in a darkening forest and fight, year after year, century after century, knowing that the woman he loved was gone, and that the world around him was slowly being swallowed by shadow. That is not a story about an elf who does not feel things. That is a story about an elf who feels everything, and has decided that feeling everything cannot be allowed to stop him. And when you understand that, the coldness he shows toward Legolas transforms completely. It is not indifference. It is the only thing Thranduil knows how to do with pain this size. He wraps it in stone because he discovered somewhere along the way that stone is the only thing that holds. The moment in the film where Thranduil finally acknowledges, in that brief, restrained way of his, that he loved Legolas's mother, and that he has never forgotten her. That moment is devastating precisely because it is so small. A lesser character would have a big, dramatic breakdown, a flood of tears, an outpouring of everything held back. Thranduil gives us a sentence and a look, and then he redirects his son toward the future. He points Legolas toward Strider, toward the ranger who will become Aragorn, toward a world that is moving forward, even as the world Thranduil built his heart around has long since gone. He cannot give Legolas the full truth, but he gives him what he can, which is a direction, a purpose, a reason to keep walking. That is Thranduil's version of love, and it is both deeply understandable and genuinely heartbreaking. There is one more dimension to this that I want to explore before we wrap up, because I think it matters and it is not always included in these discussions. Thranduil's entire character is defined by the tension between his awareness of loss and his refusal to be undone by it. He has watched the world he came from disappear. Doriath, gone. The green and uncorrupted Mirkwood of his early years, gone. His father, gone. His queen, gone. Nearly his entire army at the end of the Second Age, gone. And yet he keeps going. He rebuilds, he fortifies, he adapts. When Sauron is finally defeated at the end of the Third Age, Thranduil moves his capital south into the parts of Mirkwood that had been cleansed, renaming the forest Erin Lasgalen. He is already rebuilding again, already looking forward. A being that, broken down by loss, keeping pace with the future like that, has had to develop extraordinary emotional compartmentalization. The silence about Legolas's mother is not an exception to who Thranduil is. It is the defining example of it. He has put her somewhere so deep inside himself that it cannot threaten the functioning of the king, the protector, the one who keeps his people alive. And the terrible irony is that in doing so, he deprived his son of knowing his own history. He kept his people alive by almost certainly leaving Legolas with a wound that mirrored his own, the wound of not knowing, of being shaped by an absence that no one would ever fully explain. So why did Thranduil hide the truth about Legolas's mother? Because he was a king before he was a father, because he was a survivor before he was a widower, because the elven way of grief and healing was a door he refused to walk through, and so he never found a path back to the person who could have sat down with his son and said, "Here is what she was like. Here is what we lost. Here is why it matters." Because the armor he built was too effective, protecting him from the outside world and from the very people inside his walls who needed him most. Because Thranduil loved her so completely that speaking about her loss would have meant cracking open the one wound he could not afford to show. And in a world where showing weakness had already cost him his father, his homeland, and half his people, he was not going to let it cost him his son, too. Even if the way he protected Legolas was itself a kind of harm, even if the silence shaped Legolas into someone who learned to carry pain the same way, quietly, alone, without asking for the answers he deserved. That is not a villain's choice. That is not a cold king's indifference. That is a father who was never taught how to grieve out loud, who had spent centuries building walls because walls were the only thing that kept the darkness out, doing the only thing he knew how to do. And it is one of the most quietly devastating stories in all of Tolkien's world, hiding in the spaces between the lines, in the questions Legolas never fully asked, and the answers Thranduil never fully gave. If you made it this far, thank you. Genuinely. This is the kind of deep dive that I find endlessly rewarding, and I hope it gave you something to think about. If you want to explore more of the hidden depth in Tolkien's characters, the things that live between the lines and beneath the surface of the stories we think we already know, make sure you subscribe, because there is so much more where this came from. Drop a comment below and tell me, what do you think happened to Legolas's mother? I want to hear your theories. And if this video made you feel something, share it with someone who would appreciate it. See you in the next one.